The phone call came to Mayme Johnson's apartment at Lenox Terrace at 9 a.m. on July 8, 1968. 14 hours after her husband Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson had collapsed, clutching his chest at Wells Restaurant, and died on the way to Harlem Hospital. And when Mayme answered through tears that hadn't stopped since, Unibet had knocked on her door at 3 in the morning to deliver news that would shatter 40 years of carefully maintained composure. She heard a voice she barely recognized making condolences that sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. "Signora Ann Johnson. This is Frank Lucas," the voice said with confidence that seemed inappropriate, given that Mayme's husband had been dead for less than 12 hours. "I just wanted to call and let you know that I'm going to make sure Bumpy's organization continues running smoothly, that all the people who depended on him for work and protection are taken care of, that his legacy lives on through what I'm going to build in his name." Mayme Johnson, who had been married to Harlem's undisputed king for 20 years, who had watched politicians, police captains, Italian mob bosses, and entertainment legends defer to her husband's judgment, who understood power dynamics better than most men who claimed expertise in such matters, recognized immediately what Frank Lucas was doing, even through fog of grief that made coherent thought difficult. He was claiming succession before anyone else could, was positioning himself as Bumpy's chosen heir, despite having never been more than peripheral figure in Bumpy's actual operations, was attempting to steal crown before body was even cold. "Frank," Mayme said carefully, her voice steady despite exhaustion and heartbreak, "Bumpy never mentioned you as someone who would take over anything. He had people he trusted for different operations, people he'd known for decades, people who'd proven their loyalty through more than just words. I appreciate your condolences, but I don't think you should be making announcements about what happens next when my husband just died." Yesterday, there was brief pause before Frank Lucas responded, and in that silence, Mayme heard calculation that confirmed her instincts about why he'd called so quickly. "Mrs. Johnson, with all due respect, I was Bumpy's driver for 15 years. I was his right-hand man. I know how things work. I know who the contacts are. I know what needs to be done. The streets are going to be chaos if somebody doesn't step up immediately, and I'm the one who's in position to do it." 15 years. That was the first lie that Mayme cataloged in conversation that would eventually become foundation for 4 decades of stolen legacy and manufactured mythology. Bumpy had been in prison mostly at Alcatraz, inmate number 11, 17 AZ from 1952 until 1963 on drug conspiracy charges. He'd been free for only 5 years before his death. Even if Frank Lucas had been Bumpy's driver from the moment of his release, which Mayme knew wasn't true because she'd been there and Frank Lucas had never driven them anywhere significant, the timeline Lucas was claiming was mathematically impossible. But Mayme was 6 to 2 hours into widowhood, was facing funeral arrangements and legal complications from Bumpy dying while under federal indictment, was navigating shock and grief while simultaneously trying to figure out how to maintain dignity and security for herself and her family, now that man who'd protected them for 20 years was gone. So she didn't challenge Frank Lucas's timeline on that phone call because confronting one ambitious operator's lies seemed less important than managing immediate, practical realities of death and criminal world where vulnerability invited predation. "I need to go," Mayme said, ending conversation before Frank could continue building narrative she knew was false. "There's a lot to arrange. Thank you for calling." She hung up and stood in an apartment that still smelled like Bumpy's cologne, looking at closet full of his clothes and shelf of his books and photographs of their life together, and she made decision that would shape next 40 years. She would not publicly challenge anyone who tried to claim Bumpy's legacy while she was still processing loss, would not engage in street politics about succession and territory and operations, would maintain silence about truth regarding her husband's actual organization and the people who actually ran it. But she would remember. She would catalog every lie, and someday, when time was right, she would set records straight. Have you ever watched someone steal credit for work they didn't do, claim relationships they didn't have, build reputation on foundation of lies about person who couldn't defend themselves anymore, and chosen silence over immediate confrontation because timing mattered more than satisfaction? Subscribe to understand how 40 years of patience became perfect weapon when truth finally needed to be told. The funeral took place on July 15, 1968, at Martin's Episcopal Church in Harlem, where Mayme and Bumpy had been members for years, and more than 1,000 people attended politicians like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., entertainers like Sugar Ray Robinson and Lena Horne, community leaders who'd relied on Bumpy for everything from rent assistance to protection from predatory businesses, criminal operators from multiple organizations who respected Bumpy's authority even when they competed with his operations, police officers who'd negotiated with Bumpy to maintain peace in neighborhood they couldn't control through enforcement alone. And Frank Lucas was there, standing near front in suit that looked expensive, despite Bumpy having often lectured people in his organization about avoiding flashy displays that attracted unnecessary attention, making himself visible to everyone who mattered, positioning himself physically in space as if proximity to casket conferred legitimacy on claims he'd been making since phone call day after death. Mayme watched him network during reception at their apartment after burial at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, watched him tell stories about working with Bumpy that weren't technically lies. They included just enough truth to be defensible while implying relationship that had never existed. Watched him collect contact information from people who assumed that Bumpy's widow would have corrected any false claims if they were significantly inaccurate. She didn't correct anything, she observed. She cataloged. Say, white. Within 6 months, Frank Lucas had built operation that made him millionaire through heroin trade using contacts he claimed came from Bumpy. Mayme knew that Bumpy's actual heroin connections had been managed by entirely different people in entirely different ways. Knew that Lucas was building something new rather than continuing something old. Knew that Mythology's Lucas was constructing about being Bumpy's protégé and successor was marketing strategy rather than historical reality. Within 2 years, Lucas was calling his heroin blue magic and flooding Harlem with product whose purity and price point eliminated most competition, running organization that employed relatives from North Carolina because Lucas trusted blood over locals, cutting out Italian mafia middlemen by importing directly from Thailand through connections he developed independently of any training or assistance from Bumpy's organization. And everywhere he went, Lucas told story about how Bumpy Johnson had mentored him, had taught him everything about drug trade and power dynamics, had designated him as heir to Harlem's underworld operation story that got more elaborate with each telling, story that transformed peripheral associate into central figure, story that rewrote history while person who could have contradicted it was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. Mayme heard these stories through friends who remained in Harlem's social circles, through people who'd known Bumpy and were confused about whether Lucas's claims were accurate because why would Widow remain silent if they weren't? Through community members who asked her directly whether Frank Lucas had really been as close to Bumpy as he claimed, and she said same thing every time. Frank Lucas held Bumpy's coat sometimes. That's the extent of their relationship. But I'm not interested in street politics about who claims what. I have my memories of who my husband actually was, and that's enough for me. This response, which seemed to be about taking high road and refusing to engage in disputes beneath her dignity, was actually strategic calculation. Mayme understood that anything she said while Lucas was building his empire would be dismissed as Widow's bitterness or misunderstanding of her husband's business. That challenging. Lucas's mythology, while he was powerful and she was grieving woman in her 50s, would make her look defensive rather than authoritative. That waiting until she could tell complete story from position of strength rather than vulnerability would be more effective than fighting battles piecemeal while emotionally compromised socialite. She maintained apartment at Lenox Terrace. She attended church at St. Martin's Episcopal. She did charitable work that had always been important to her. She watched Frank Lucas get arrested in 1975, convicted in 1976, sentenced to 70 years in prison before cooperating with prosecutors to reduce sentence in exchange for providing information about corrupt police officers and other criminals. And she continued cataloging lies. In 1984, Lucas was convicted again for attempting to exchange heroin for cocaine. In 1991, he was released from prison. In early 2000s, journalists began interviewing Lucas about his career, and his stories became more grandiose. Claimed he'd smuggled drugs in coffins of dead servicemen returning from Vietnam. Claim that his Thai connection would later deny. Claimed he'd made $1 million per day. Exaggeration, according to prosecutors. claimed he'd been Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man for 15 years, impossible timeline that nobody fact-checked, because primary witnesses were either dead or disinterested. In contradicting successful criminals, Mythology. Comment below whether you would have challenged lies immediately even knowing you'd be dismissed, or whether you would have waited decades for a moment when truth would be heard most clearly. Whether patience or confrontation serves truth better when power dynamics make immediate honesty ineffective. Then in 2007, Universal Pictures released American Gangster, directed by Ridley Scott and starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas, and everything Mayme had been patient about for 39 years became intolerable. The film opened with scene of Bumpy Johnson dying in front of Frank Lucas's electronics store, teaching Lucas' final lesson about Harlem as he collapsed, symbolically passing torch from mentor to protégé, scene that bore no resemblance to reality where Bumpy had died at Wells' restaurant eating his favorite meal while Frank Lucas was elsewhere, where Bumpy had never designated Lucas as anything except occasional associate, where their relationship had been peripheral rather than central. The film showed Lucas living in brownstone with Bumpy's organization, being integrated into family operations, learning drug trade from Bumpy's direct instruction narrative that contradicted everything Mayme knew about her own life, because Frank Lucas had never lived with them at 120th Street, not 121st, as film claimed, had never been integrated into family operations, had never been taught anything substantial by Bumpy because Bumpy didn't trust him enough to reveal organizational secrets. The film portrayed Bumpy Johnson as Lucas's mentor, father figure, and predecessor in a way that made Lucas's heroin empire seem like natural continuation of Bumpy's work, rather than separate operation built on different principles with different methods portrayal that allowed Lucas to claim legitimacy through association with legendary figure while fundamentally misrepresenting nature of that association. Mayme Johnson watched American Gangster in theater in Philadelphia, where she'd moved in 2003, and she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 39 years of calculated patience, rage, not just at Frank Lucas, though certainly at him for spending for decades constructing mythology that stole her husband's legacy and attached it to criminal empire that Bumpy would have managed differently. But also at Hollywood for not fact-checking Lucas's claims before immortalizing them in major motion picture, at journalists who'd interviewed Lucas without verifying timeline or consulting widow who'd been married to man Lucas claimed as mentor, at everyone who'd assumed that silence meant consent rather than strategic patience. She was 93 years old. She'd been widow for 39 years. She'd maintained dignified silence through Frank Lucas's empire, his arrest, his conviction, his cooperation with authorities, his release, his increasingly grandiose claims about relationship with Bumpy Johnson, and now she was going to destroy every lie Frank Lucas had ever told about her husband. The first call Mayme Johnson made after watching American Gangster was to Karen E. Quinones Miller, her goddaughter and former Philadelphia Inquirer reporter who'd known Bumpy Johnson since she was 8 years old, growing up in Harlem, who understood both journalistic standards for verification and cultural context of Harlem's underworld politics, who could help Mayme tell a story that would be believed, because it would be documented rather than just asserted. "I need to write book," Mayme said without preamble when Karen answered phone. "I need to set record straight about who Bumpy actually was, about what Frank Lucas's real relationship with him actually was, about what's true and what's mythology. I've been silent for almost 40 years. And I'm done being silent. Will you help me?" Karen agreed immediately, understanding what Mayme was proposing. Not just memoir or biography, but correction of historical record that had been falsified through decades of lies that nobody had challenged because primary source who could have contradicted them had chosen strategic patience over immediate confrontation. They began working on Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson in 2007, immediately after American Gangster was released, and the book would be published in 2008 by Ocean Publishing's Mall Press that Karen ran specifically to publish stories that mainstream publishers might not prioritize, stories that needed to be told for historical accuracy rather than for mass market appeal. The research process involved Mayme providing documentation that Frank Lucas and his Hollywood promoters hadn't bothered to verify. Prison records showing Bumpy was incarcerated 1952 to 1963, making 15 years as his driver mathematically impossible. Visitor logs from Alcatraz showing people who actually visited Bumpy during imprisonment, lists that didn't include Frank Lucas. Photographs of social events showing Bumpy's actual inner circle group that didn't include Frank Lucas in any prominent way. Testimony from people like Nat Pettigrew, Unibird, Sonny Chance, and others who'd been Bumpy's actual associates and who'd never considered Frank Lucas to be a significant figure in Bumpy's organization. Most importantly, the book included Mayme's direct refutation of specific claims from American Gangster and from Lucas's various interviews. Frank Lucas never spent one night in my house. We did not live in Brownstone as shown in film. We lived at Lenox Terrace on 120th Street, not 121st. Frank was never integrated into family operations. He was never Bumpy's right-hand man. He wasn't present when Bumpy died. Their relationship was peripheral. At best, Frank might have held Bumpy's coat occasionally, but that's different from being protégé or designated successor. The publication of Harlem Godfather in 2008 created immediate controversy. Frank Lucas, who'd spent 40 years building mythology that portrayed him as Bumpy Johnson's heir, and had recently received millions of dollars from American Gangster's success based on that mythology, found himself facing Widow, who'd been silent for 4 decades, suddenly providing documented evidence that his entire origin story was fabrication. Lucas attempted to defend his claims in interviews, but he couldn't overcome fundamental problem. Mayme had documents, photographs, testimony from multiple witnesses, and timeline analysis that made his 15 years as driver claim obviously false. Lucas had stories that sounded good but couldn't be verified. Mayme had facts that could be checked. More significantly, Mayme had credibility that Lucas lacked. She was a 93-year-old widow known for charitable work and church membership, who'd waited 40 years to speak publicly, who wasn't trying to sell movie rights or glorify criminal career, who simply wanted historical record to reflect truth about husbands she'd loved, rather than mythology created by someone who'd stolen his legacy. Have you ever watched someone who built reputation on lies confront person armed with truth? Seen fabricated narrative collapse when confronted with documentation that can't be disputed? Understood that most powerful weapon against mythology isn't compete in mythology, but simple, verified facts. Leave a like if you appreciate that sometimes destroying someone's false empire doesn't require violence or a complicated strategy, but just refusing to let lies remain unchallenged. The media coverage of Harlem Godfather focused on 2 aspects that made story compelling beyond just widow-correcting record. First, the age factor. Mayme was 93 years old when book was published, had become author for a first time in her life specifically, to contradict movie that had been released months earlier, had decided that final years of her life needed to include setting records straight even though staying silent would have been easier. Second, the patience factor. She'd waited 39 years from Bumpy's death until book's publication, had maintained strategic silence through entire period when challenging. Lucas's claims might have seemed like widow's bitterness, had chosen moment when she could tell complete story from position of moral authority rather than emotional vulnerability. Interviews with Mayme after book's publication revealed what she'd been thinking during those decades of silence. I knew immediately after Bumpy died that Frank Lucas was lying about their relationship. But if I'd said something in 1968 or 1975 or even 1990s, people would have thought I was a bitter widow who didn't understand my husband's business or who resented his associate's success. So I waited. I remembered everything. I collected documentation. And when Frank got movie made that portrayed their relationship as central rather than peripheral, that was when I knew it was time to correct, record not out of bitterness, but because history matters and truth matters, and my husband's actual legacy deserves to be preserved accurately. The book's impact extended beyond just contradicting Frank Lucas's specific claims. It provided first complete biography of Bumpy Johnson, written by someone who'd actually lived with him for 20 years, who'd been present for conversations and decisions that shaped Harlem's underworld politics, who understood both criminal operations and legitimate community leadership roles that Bumpy had maintained simultaneously. It documented Bumpy's actual relationships with people like Madame Stephanie Claire, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, Joe Louis, Sidney Poitier, Sugar Ray Robinson, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and others who'd been part of Harlem's cultural and political landscape that were based on mutual respect and shared commitment to black communities' well-being rather than just criminal enterprise. It explained Bumpy's philosophy about power and protection, about how he'd maintained order in Harlem by being fair arbiter rather than violent dictator, about how he'd protected community businesses from predatory practices by Italian mob and corrupt police, about how he'd provided services that legitimate authorities couldn't or wouldn't provide to black neighborhood that structural racism had relegated to second-class status. And it made clear that Frank Lucas's heroin empire, whatever its financial abandonment of principles that Bumpy had maintained throughout his career, that flooding community with addictive drugs for maximum profit was antithetical to Bumpy's approach of providing illegal services while protecting community from worst effects of criminal operations. Frank Lucas's Mythology had portrayed him as Bumpy's natural successor, had suggested that his heroin empire was continuation of Bumpy's work using methods Bumpy had taught him. Mayme's book destroyed that narrative by showing that Lucas's operation was actually betrayal of everything Bumpy had stood for, that the only thing Lucas had inherited from Bumpy was geographical territory, that claiming to be Bumpy's protégé while running operation that Bumpy would have opposed was ultimate form of stolen valor. The response from Harlem community was overwhelming support for Mayme's account. People who'd known Bumpy personally confirmed what Mayme had written about Lucas being peripheral rather than central figure. People who'd watched Lucas build mythology over decades appreciated that someone had finally provided documented correction. People who'd valued Bumpy's actual legacy recognized that Mayme was defending his memory not just for her own sake, but for historical accuracy that would preserve truth about important figure in Harlem's history. Subscribe for more stories about how patience becomes power, how truth defeats mythologies when timing is right, how 90 widow armed with documents and memories can destroy decades of lies told by arrogant criminal who thought silence meant nobody would ever challenge his fabricated narrative about relationship with man he barely knew. Henry Perkins, Harlem restaurator, and close friend of both Mayme and Bumpy, summarized impact of book perfectly. Mayme was class act, and she had big heart. She was sweetest woman in world, but she didn't take any nonsense. She carried herself like real lady and expected to be treated as such. When Frank Lucas spent 40 years lying about being Bumpy's right-hand man, Mayme didn't respond immediately because she knew nobody would believe her while she was grieving widow and he was building empire. She waited until she was 93 years old, until Frank had made millions from movie based on lies, until she could present documented case that couldn't be disputed. And then she destroyed every false claim he'd ever made, not through violence or street politics, but through simple act of telling truth and backing it up with evidence. The book's publication in 2008 came at perfect moment. American Gangster was still recent enough that people remembered its portrayal of Bumpy-Lucas relationship. Frank Lucas was still giving interviews promoting mythology that film had immortalized, and Mayme was still alive to provide authoritative correction from person who'd actually been there. If she'd waited longer, she might have died before setting records straight. If she'd spoken earlier, she might have been dismissed as bitter widow. The timing 40 years after Bumpy's death, 1 year after American Gangster's release, was exactly right. Film companies immediately began negotiating to purchase rights to Harlem Godfather for potential adaptation, recognizing that Mayme's story was compelling both as historical correction and as character study of woman who'd maintained strategic silence for 4 decades before, finally speaking truth that destroyed arrogant man's fabricated legacy. Mayme was notified about these negotiations 2 days before her death in May 2009 at age 94, 1 year after book's publication. 41 years after Bumpy's death, long enough to see that her decision to speak truth had been vindicated by public response that believed her evidence over Lucas's mythology. She was tickled pink to tell people she was an author at age 93, Perkins said. Boy, it really made her proud to finally get that book done. Not because it made her famous or made her money, but because she knew she'd set records straight about Bumpy, had protected his legacy from being stolen by someone who'd barely known him, had shown that patience and truth were more powerful weapons than anything Frank Lucas had ever used in his criminal career. What Mayme Johnson accomplished through Harlem Godfather wasn't just correction of biographical details or refutation of specific faults claims. It was demonstration of how power actually works when deployed by someone who understands timing, documentation, credibility, and strategic patience better than people who mistake volume for authority or mythology for truth. Frank Lucas had spent 40 years building narrative that portrayed him as central figure in Harlem's underworld history, that attached his identity to Bumpy Johnson's legendary reputation, that allowed him to claim legitimacy through association with man whose actual relationship with him had been minimal. He'd told stories to journalists, to Hollywood producers, to anyone who would listen, and those stories had gone largely unchallenged because primary witness who could have contradicted them had chosen silence. That silence wasn't weakness or ignorance or acceptance, it was strategy. Mayme Johnson understood that challenging Frank Lucas's mythology while he was building heroin empire would have made her look like grieving widow who didn't understand street politics or who resented her husband's associate's success. She understood that speaking out during his criminal trials would have seemed like piling on or seeking attention during newsworthy events. She understood that contradicting his claims during his years of freedom would have devolved into he said she said arguments. That would have been impossible to resolve without documentation. So she waited until she could provide that documentation. She waited until Frank Lucas had built mythology so elaborate that its collapse would be spectacular rather than footnote. She waited until she was 93 years old and could speak from position of moral authority that came from age, from charitable reputation, from church membership, from decades of dignified silence, finally broken by publication that provided evidence rather than just assertions. And when she finally spoke, her truth destroyed every lie that Frank Lucas had told. Not through violence, not through street politics, not through competing mythology, through simple presentation of facts that could be verified. Prison records, visitor logs, photographs, testimony from multiple witnesses, timeline analysis that made 15 years as driver mathematically impossible. The widow's weapon was truth, deployed at exactly right moment, backed by documentation that couldn't be disputed, presented by person whose credibility exceeded mythology makers by every measure that mattered to people who cared about historical accuracy, rather than entertaining stories. What happened next after book's publication, after Frank Lucas's mythology was exposed as fabrication, after Mayme had set records straight about Bumpy's actual legacies, was that history remembered truth rather than lies. Not immediately, not universally. Because American Gangster remains popular film and Frank Lucas's claims are still repeated by people who don't know about Mayme's correction. But among people who actually study Harlem's history, among scholars who research organized crime in black communities, among community members who knew Bumpy Johnson personally, Mayme's account is accepted as accurate, while Frank Lucas's claims are recognized as self-serving mythology. That's what Mayme Johnson accomplished by waiting 40 years to speak. By being patient enough to let timing work in her favor, by understanding that destroying arrogant man's false empire required not matching his tactics, but deploying entirely different weapon he couldn't defend against because he'd built everything on. Foundation of lies that collapsed when confronted with documented truth. She lived 1 year after book's publication, long enough to see its impact, long enough to know that her husband's legacy had been protected from theft by someone who'd barely known him, long enough to understand that her decision to wait rather than respond immediately had been correct strategic choice. Mayme Johnson died on May 1, 2009, in Philadelphia, at age 90. Her obituary noted that she was author who'd published her first book at age 9. Her friends remembered her as woman who carried herself like lady and didn't take any nonsense. Her community remembered her as Bumpy Johnson's widow who'd finally told truth after 40 years of strategic silence. And Frank Luke Asgood claimed to be Bumpy Johnson's protégé, right-hand man, designated successor. Close confidante was remembered as man whose entire origin story had been destroyed by widow who'd waited until perfect moment to present evidence he couldn't refute, whose mythology couldn't survive confrontation with documented facts, whose arrogance in stealing dead man's legacy had been answered not with violence, but with something more powerful, simple, patient, devastating truth. The lesson from Mayme Johnson's story isn't just about correcting false claims or defending deceased spouse's reputation. It's about understanding that most effective way to destroy lies isn't always immediate confrontation, but strategic patience, combined with documentation and credibility, that makes truth undeniable when it's finally presented. Frank Lewis built heroin empire and became multi-millionaire. But he couldn't build reputation that would survive confrontation with 93-year-old widow who'd spent 40 years collecting evidence and waiting for right moment to destroy every false claim he'd made about relationship with husband he barely knew. That's real power. Not violence. Not criminal enterprise. Not self-promoting mythology. Just truth, told by credible witness, backed by documentation, delivered at exactly right moment after decades of strategic patience that allowed lies to become so elaborate that their collapse would be spectacular rather than subtle. Mayme Johnson destroyed Frank Lucas's stolen legacy not because she was more violent or more connected or more wealthy, but because she understood something he didn't. That silence can be strategy rather than weakness. That patience can be weapon rather than passivity. That truth told at right moment by right person with right evidence is more powerful than any mythology built on foundation of lies. What she did next after waiting 40 years, after writing book at age 93, after presenting documented evidence that destroyed Frank Lucas's claims, was exactly what she'd always planned to do. She let truth speak for itself, and then she rested, knowing that her husband's actual legacy had been preserved for history rather than being stolen by arrogant man who'd thought that nobody would ever challenge his fabricated narrative about relationship with Harlem's king.